Let's get started. Story number 1.
The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse. The storm outside was fierce, and the snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, obscuring the view of anything beyond the yard. The house seemed to groan under the weight of the snow, and the fire crackled softly in the living room, providing the only warmth in the freezing air. Inside, everything was still. The only sound was the faint rustling of wind and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. Clara sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a thick woolen blanket, her eyes flicking nervously to the shadows in the corners of the room. She had always loved this farmhouse, inherited from her grandparents who had long since passed. But tonight, there was something different. The air felt heavier, as if something was lurking just out of sight. It had been a quiet evening. Clara had spent the day in town, picking up supplies for the coming weeks, knowing that the snowstorm would make travel impossible for a while. She had come back home just as the storm began, and now she was alone, the house empty, except for her and the occasional stray animal that could be seen in the snow through the windows. As the night grew darker, the storm intensified. The wind outside seemed to grow angrier, rattling the house and making the trees sway and creak as if protesting the weight of the snow. Clara shivered and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She had never been one for superstitions, but tonight something felt wrong. The power had gone out an hour ago, and the house was now lit only by candlelight. Clara hadn't thought much of it at first, but now, in the eerie stillness of the house, she began to wonder if it would ever return. The thought of spending the night in complete darkness made her uneasy, but she knew there was little to be done. The storm was too fierce for her to venture out to check the power lines. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a soft thud followed by a faint creak. Clara froze. The sound had come from upstairs, from the direction of the attic. She strained her ears trying to listen, but the storm outside seemed to drown out any other sounds. It wasn't uncommon for the house to make noises, old houses often did, but this sound, this soft, deliberate thud, was different. Clara stood up from the armchair and walked cautiously toward the stairs. She hesitated at the bottom, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she stared up the dark staircase. The attic door was at the top of the stairs, its wooden frame old and chipped. Clara had always been afraid of the attic ever since she was a child. It was dark up there, and there was something unsettling about the space. But tonight something told her she needed to check. With her heart pounding in her chest, Clara took a step forward. The floorboards creaked under her weight, and she paused, straining her ears for any further sound. She could feel the weight of the house settling, the quiet creaks and groans that had once been familiar to her, now sounding ominous and threatening. She reached the top of the stairs and stood there for a moment, gathering the courage to open the attic door. The thud had sounded again, followed by a dragging noise, like something heavy being moved across the floor. Clara's pulse quickened as she reached for the door handle. The door swung open with a groan, revealing the dark, musty space beyond. The attic was as she remembered it, dusty, with old trunks and boxes scattered around. The beams of the house were exposed above, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. Nothing seemed out of place. But then Clara saw it, a shadow moving quickly across the far corner of the room. Her breath caught in her throat as the shadow darted out of view. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes darting around the room. The air felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped significantly in the last few minutes. Clara's skin prickled with a sudden, inexplicable fear. She stepped deeper into the attic, the wooden floor creaking under her feet. Her eyes searched every corner, but she saw nothing. The shadow, if it had ever been there, was gone. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something moving in one of the boxes near the far wall. It was small, a flicker of movement, like a shadow flitting across the surface of the box. Clara felt a cold chill run down her spine as she slowly approached the box. Her hand trembled as she reached out to open it. When she lifted the lid, she found nothing inside but dust and old, tattered blankets. But there, on the bottom of the box, was something else, something that made her blood run cold. A single frozen handprint pressed into the dust. The print was small, childlike, and it seemed to shimmer with an unnatural coldness, as if it had been left there just moments ago. Clara gasped, stumbling backward as a sudden, sharp gust of cold air swept through the attic. The temperature seemed to plummet even further, and the storm outside howled louder, almost as if it were reacting to the presence in the attic. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps as she turned to flee, but before she could move, a whisper, sounded from behind her. "Leave." Clara froze, her heart thundering in her chest. The voice was faint, barely audible over the howling wind, but it was unmistakable. It was a child's voice, soft and pleading, but full of warning. She whipped around, but there was no one there. The room felt suffocating now, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. Clara stumbled backward, her feet tangling in the dust-covered floorboards. She fell to the ground, her heart racing as she scrambled to get back to her feet. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, stretching toward her, and the coldness deepened. Another whisper, this time louder. "Leave. Now." Clara's mind raced. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she had to get out of the attic. She pushed herself to her feet and bolted toward the stairs, her breath coming in frantic gasps. But as she reached the top of the stairs, she felt something cold and icy, brush against her ankle. She looked down, and her heart nearly stopped. A small, pale hand was reaching up from the darkness at the bottom of the stairs. It was the same childlike hand, frozen and pale, with fingers stretched toward her. Clara screamed and stumbled backward, falling down the stairs in her panic. The coldness followed her, wrapping around her like a vice, seeping into her very bones. She hit the floor at the bottom of the stairs, dazed and breathless, her mind swirling in a haze of terror. She pushed herself to her feet, only to find the room around her had changed. The walls were covered in frost, and the air was thick with an unnatural cold. The fireplace had gone cold, and the candles had flickered out. The whispering voice was all around her now, louder and more insistent. "Leave or stay forever." Clara's eyes darted around the room, but there was no sign of the figure, no shadow, no child's form. She could feel the presence, though, like a weight pressing down on her chest. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting for her decision. She didn't need to think twice. She ran to the door, throwing it open, and stumbled out into the snowstorm. The cold hit her like a slap to the face, but it was nothing compared to the chill she had just left behind. She didn't stop running, didn't look back as she made her way toward the road, toward the town. As she ran, the whispers followed her, carried on the wind. "Leave, leave, leave." Clara didn't stop until she reached the safety of the town, the storm still raging behind her. She never went back to the farmhouse again, and no one in the town ever heard from her again. But on cold, snowy nights, when the wind howls through the trees and the snow falls thick and heavy, people say you can still hear the whispers. And if you listen closely, you might hear the faint sound of a child's voice, pleading from the darkness. "Leave."
Story number 2.
It was a cold, snowy night when I found myself in that remote cabin in the woods, far away from the comforts of civilization. The kind of night where the snow fell in heavy, thick flakes that blurred the edges of the world. I had always been someone who appreciated solitude, and when I'd found the old cabin through a rental listing online, it seemed like the perfect place to escape for a few days of peace. A winter retreat to clear my mind. I had no idea then what I would be walking into. The cabin was isolated, nestled between thick woods, and as I pulled up the long gravel road leading to it, the feeling of being cut off from everything hit me. The roads were empty, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The only sound was the crunch of snow beneath the tires of my car. It was just after dark when I arrived. The cabin had a rustic charm, the kind you'd see in a picture-perfect postcard. It was small, with a stone fireplace that immediately drew my attention, and the faint glow of a lamp through the windows suggested warmth inside. The owner had left the key under a flower pot by the door, and I let myself in, hoping to get settled before the storm rolled in. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the cold. Despite the light from the lamp, the air was chilling. The heating system was working, but the cabin felt like it had been empty for a while. I rubbed my hands together and shook off the snow, then started the fire. The crackling sound of the flames was comforting, and the warmth it brought soon made the cold in my bones fade. I unpacked my bags, threw a few logs on the fire, and made a cup of tea. The storm outside was getting worse by the minute. The wind howled against the cabin, rattling the windows, and snow piled up in heavy drifts. I looked out the window a few times, but the blizzard outside had turned the world into a featureless white blur. The storm was expected to last for hours, maybe even days. That was fine with me. I didn't plan on leaving anytime soon. As the night deepened, I decided to retire early. I turned off the lights, letting the soft glow of the fireplace illuminate the room. I wrapped myself in the thick quilt on the bed, the weight of it soothing. My eyelids grew heavy as the warmth and exhaustion settled in. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a soft creaking sound, like wood groaning under the weight of the snow outside. But it didn't stop there. It was followed by a dragging noise, something scraping across the floor. I opened my eyes, my heart beginning to race. I turned my head, half expecting to see a shadow in the corner of the room. But there was nothing, just the flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. I brushed it off. The house was old, the floorboards creaky. The wind outside was brutal, and the cabin itself probably wasn't in the best shape. But the noise continued, more distinct this time. Something heavy was being dragged across the floor. I sat up in bed, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was the house settling. But the sound grew louder, coming from the other side of the cabin. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and slowly got up, tiptoeing toward the source of the noise. The creaking floorboards underfoot seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. When I reached the hallway, the dragging sound stopped, and the house fell eerily still. I didn't know whether to go toward it or not. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pushed open the door to the other room, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. It was the kitchen, dimly lit by a faint light coming from the hallway. I walked in, sweeping the flashlight across the room. The cabinets, countertops, and the old cast-iron stove were all in place. No sign of anything unusual. But then I saw it. On the far wall, a small, round mirror hung crookedly. The glass was fogged, except for a few smudged marks that seemed too precise to be natural. I stepped closer, squinting at the mirror. The surface cleared for a moment, and I could just make out a shape, a figure standing behind me, tall and thin, its features indistinct. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was no one there. Only the empty, cold kitchen. I stepped back, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The wind outside howled, and the snow piled up against the windows. The noise was deafening, but it didn't drown the feeling of someone, or something, watching me. I backed out of the kitchen slowly, never taking my eyes off the mirror. The floor creaked again. This time, it wasn't the wind. I turned to find that the door to the room at the end of the hall was ajar, a thin sliver of dark space peeking through. I hadn't opened that door. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move toward it, my flashlight shaking in my hand. As I pushed the door open, the temperature in the hallway dropped. I could see my breath fogging in the air. The room was empty, or at least it looked empty at first. It was another small bedroom like the one I had been sleeping in. The bed was covered with an old quilt, and a chair sat near the corner. But then my flashlight flickered, and I saw something move. A figure stood in the corner, cloaked in shadow. Its shape was indistinct, but I could tell it wasn't a person. The air around it was thick with cold, and I could almost feel the presence pressing in on me. I stepped back, tripping over the threshold of the room, landing hard on the floor. The shadow shifted, moving toward me in jerky, unnatural steps. My blood ran cold, and I scrambled to get to my feet. That's when I heard it again, the soft, dragging sound. But this time, it was coming from the direction of the figure, and it sounded closer. I could barely breathe, panic rising in my chest. The shadow was moving closer, the dragging noise following it like a heartbeat. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and bolted for the door, running back down the hallway. But as I reached the living room, I heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging behind me. I turned to look over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the dark emptiness of the cabin. I ran out the front door into the snow, not caring about the freezing cold biting at my skin. The storm whipped against me, the snow stinging my face, but I didn't stop. I kept running, my heart hammering in my chest, the dragging sound echoing in my ears as though it were right behind me. I didn't stop until I was far enough to see the lights of a distant town twinkling through the snowstorm. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was in there, or what I heard that night, but the memory haunts me every winter when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls outside. Every time I see a mirror, I can't help but feel a chill crawl up my spine, and I wonder if whatever I encountered that night is still out there, waiting.
Story number 3.
The snow fell thickly that night, blanketing everything in an eerie, white silence. The wind howled through the trees, sending branches creaking and groaning under the weight of the winter storm. I had been traveling all day, and by the time I reached the old farmhouse I had rented for the weekend, it was already dark. I pulled the car into the long, snow-covered driveway, the tires slipping slightly as I parked in front of the house. It was a large, isolated place, the kind of house that could be charming on a normal day, but now, under the shadows of the storm, felt more like a looming fortress. The house was a little run down, but the price had been right. I had always enjoyed the quiet, and the house seemed like a perfect place to escape for a few days of solitude. No one would be out here in this weather, and I welcomed the thought of having time to myself. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and hurried to the front door, that's the wind biting at my face as the snow swirled around me. I fumbled with the old brass key in the door lock, finally getting it open and stepping inside. The house was dark and cold, and the air smelled of dust and something else, something faint, almost like damp earth. It didn't take long to realize that the heating system wasn't on, and the house was freezing. But that didn't worry me too much. I had seen the fireplace when I'd toured the house earlier, and figured I'd be able to get a fire going. The interior of the house was large and slightly cluttered, with worn furniture scattered throughout. A set of stairs led up to the second floor, and the wooden floors creaked underfoot as I walked through the living room toward the fireplace. After some effort, I managed to light a fire, the flames crackling and snapping as the heat slowly started to fill the room. I threw my bag on the couch and unpacked a few things, then made myself a cup of tea to help warm up. The storm outside was getting worse, the wind rattling the windows and the snow falling in thick sheets. It felt like the world had disappeared behind the wall of white, and I could barely see more than a few feet past the window. I had been planning to spend the evening reading a book and relaxing, but as the night went on, the atmosphere in the house started to change. At first, it was subtle, just a slight unease in the air. The temperature seemed to drop even further, despite the fire burning in the hearth. The wind outside howled, and the house seemed to groan in response, as if it was shifting with the weight of the storm. It wasn't just the wind making those noises. I could hear something else too. The faintest creaking of floorboards, as though someone was walking around upstairs. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was probably just the house settling. It was old, after all, and old houses had their quirks. But as the minutes passed, that feeling of being watched, of something being off, only grew stronger. The creaking continued, and now there was something else, something heavier, like a dragging sound. It was faint at first, almost like a soft scrape against the wood, but it was there. I set down my tea and stood up, straining my ears to listen. The dragging sound continued, and it seemed to be coming from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. The house was supposed to be empty. The owner had told me that no one else would be there for the weekend. I was alone. I took a few cautious steps toward the stairs. The house was silent for a moment, and then, just as I reached the base of the stairs, I heard a door creak open, slowly as if something was pushing it open with great care. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. It wasn't the wind. The storm outside might have been wild, but this was something else. I stood still, my pulse pounding in my ears, wondering if I should go up and check it out, or if I should leave the house altogether. But I didn't want to seem irrational. I wanted to believe that there was some logical explanation. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and slowly ascended the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, and I cursed myself for being so paranoid. The dragging sound had stopped, but the eerie silence that followed only made things worse. I reached the top of the stairs and peered down the dark hallway. There were 2 bedrooms at the end of the hall, one on each side, both with their doors slightly ajar. The door at the far end of the hall was the one that had creaked open. I didn't know why, but something compelled me to go toward it. My hands were trembling as I reached out to push the door open, the old wood protesting as it shifted. The room was dark, and I could barely make out anything inside. The faintest slivers of moonlight filtered in through the blinds, but it wasn't enough to see clearly. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room appeared to be a guest bedroom, with a simple bed and a small nightstand. But it was what was on the floor next to the bed that caught my eye. There was a trail of dark smudges, footprints, but they didn't look like they were made by shoes. The prints were faint but distinct, leading from the bed toward the corner of the room. I knelt down to examine them, my heart pounding. The prints were cold to the touch, as if they had been there for a long time. I ran my hand along the floor, feeling the dampness of the wood beneath my fingers. It was strange, unsettling. I could hear the wind howling outside, but inside the room it was dead silent. Suddenly, I heard it again, the dragging noise. This time it was closer. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the far corner of the room. Nothing. But the air felt heavier, colder. My breath came out in sharp, shallow bursts as I backed toward the door. I turned to leave the room, but as I reached for the doorknob, I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, coming from behind me. It was a voice, faint but unmistakable. A voice that sounded like it was calling my name. "Get out!" I spun around, my heart racing. There was no one there. The room was empty. The door was open. The house was as silent as the grave. But the temperature had dropped significantly, and the air felt thick, oppressive. I didn't wait. I slammed the door shut and bolted down the stairs. My breath came in quick gasps, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. The dragging noise followed me, getting louder, closer, until I reached the living room. I ran for the door, fumbling with the lock as the cold air from outside seemed to pour into the room. Finally, the door swung open, and I didn't look back. I ran into the snow, my feet slipping on the icy ground as I made my way toward the car. The wind stung my face, but I didn't care. I didn't stop until I was safely inside the car, the engine roaring to life. I didn't stay in that house. I drove all the way back to town that night, the snowstorm still raging around me. I didn't know what I had experienced, what I had heard or seen in that house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching me, waiting for me to return. And to this day, I haven't returned to that farmhouse. I don't know what happened that night, but I do know one thing. I will never forget the cold that settled into my bones and the whisper that called my name in the dark. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The snowstorm had been building all day. It started as small flakes in the morning, barely noticeable, but by the time dusk settled, the sky had thickened with dark clouds and the air was biting cold. The drive had been treacherous, but I had finally reached my destination, an old, rustic cabin nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. It was the kind of place where you could truly get away from everything, and that's exactly what I needed. I had planned this trip months ago, a solo retreat to clear my mind after a difficult year, no distractions, no work, no one else around, just peace and solitude in the quiet of the wilderness. But as the storm picked up, I began to feel an unsettling sense of isolation, as if the world was closing in around me. The cabin was even older than I had expected. The walls creaked with the weight of the years, and the front door was a struggle to open, as if the wood had swollen from years of exposure to the harsh winters. But inside, the cabin was cozy, with a stone fireplace that beckoned me to get a fire started. I hurried to unpack, throwing my bags on the bed in the corner of the room, then setting to work gathering kindling. The warmth of the fire was a comfort as the storm raged outside, but there was something else, a coldness that seemed to seep from the walls, a chill that the fire could not touch. I set up in the living room, arranging a few blankets and pillows on the couch, making myself comfortable. The wind howled, rattling the windows, but I was too tired to care. The cabin felt safe enough. I had no reason to feel uneasy. I had rented places like this before, and they had always been peaceful. Yet, as I settled in with a cup of tea, there was an undeniable feeling, that something wasn't quite right. The fire crackled loudly, and the wind outside seemed to grow louder, pushing against the walls of the cabin. The windows, though thick with frost, rattled beneath the pressure. I told myself that it was just the storm, that it was normal for an old house to make strange noises in a heavy blizzard. But then, from somewhere deeper in the cabin, I heard a noise. At first, it was soft, almost imperceptible, a faint scraping sound, like something heavy dragging across the floor. I froze, listening intently. It was coming from upstairs. I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them were particularly comforting. The cabin was small, 2 stories, with a single staircase leading to the second floor. I hadn't even been up there yet, but I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the noise. It was the sense that something was watching me. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. It was just the storm, just the wind. But the sound continued, closer now, dragging, scraping, like something or someone was moving slowly across the floor. I stood in the living room, my heart pounding, torn between checking it out and ignoring it. The rational part of me told me to go upstairs, to confront whatever it was, but every instinct screamed at me to leave the cabin, to drive back into town and away from this place. But I didn't. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way to the staircase, trying to quell the rising anxiety in my chest. The beam of light flickered as I shone it toward the top of the stairs. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I reached the top of the stairs, the wood creaking beneath my feet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but I pressed on, moving toward the farthest bedroom, the one that seemed to be the source of the dragging sound. The door was ajar, just a crack, and I pushed it open slowly, half expecting something or someone to leap out at me, but nothing. The room was empty, just a simple bed with a worn quilt and a nightstand next to it. But then I saw it, a chair positioned in the corner facing the window. It was old, with a high back and thin, spindly legs, and sitting in that chair there was a small object. A doll, its porcelain face cracked and its eyes dark, lifeless. It was as though it had been placed there on purpose. My stomach turned. I didn't know why, but the sight of that doll unsettled me more than I could explain. I stepped closer, flashlight in hand, trying to figure out what was so unsettling about it. I reached for the doll, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. It was cold to the touch, even colder than the air in the room, and I shuddered, putting it back on the chair. As I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. The door wasn't supposed to close on its own. My pulse raced as I fumbled for the doorknob, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but it was stuck. My breath came out in quick, sharp gasps as the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. And then I heard it. A voice, faint and whispering, but unmistakable. It came from behind me. Leave. My blood ran cold. I turned around slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping the room. There was no one there. The room was empty, except for the doll, still sitting on the chair. But it wasn't just the doll. There was something else, something that wasn't quite visible. A shape, a shadow, standing in the far corner of the room, just out of reach of the light. The air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive weight. My head felt foggy, as if my thoughts were slowing and my vision blurred. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, my body refusing to obey my mind. The whisper came again, louder this time. Leave, now. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. With a surge of adrenaline, I yanked the door open, running down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back as I flew down the stairs and out the door, the snow now falling in thick, swirling gusts. I could still hear the whisper in my head, still feel the presence of something in that house, watching me, waiting for me to return. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, shivering from the cold, but too terrified to think about anything else. The headlights of my car cut through the storm as I sped down the icy road, the snow sticking to the windshield as I drove toward town. The storm raged, but I didn't care. I didn't know what had happened in that cabin, but I never wanted to find out. The cabin had been peaceful before, but now it was a place of darkness, a place where something malevolent lurked. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that night. The cold, the whisper, the feeling that something had been watching me from the shadows. I don't know who or what was in that cabin, but I know that I will never return, and I will never forget the warning it gave me. Leave. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The night the snowstorm arrived was colder than anyone had predicted. It had started as a light flurry, a soft dusting on the roads, but by nightfall the wind had picked up, howling across the hills, and the snow fell in thick, blinding sheets. It wasn't long before the town's streets were barely passable, the visibility so poor that even the few cars still trying to make it through slowed to a crawl. Inside homes, people huddled by their fireplaces, hoping the warmth of the fire would hold back the bitter cold creeping in through the cracks in their windows. For Sam, the storm was just another night in the quiet country house he had inherited from his grandparents. A cold night like this seemed to settle in more deeply within the walls of the old house, and he relished the solitude. There was something peaceful about the isolation. No neighbors, no sounds of cars or traffic, just the wind outside and the occasional creak of the house settling into the snowdrift. He had always liked it here, even when the rest of the town whispered about the strange happenings, the stories of the house being haunted. Sam had dismissed them as the overactive imaginations of small-town folk with too much time on their hands. But this night felt different. Sam had been living in the house for almost a year now, and he had gotten used to the noises, creaking floorboards, the odd draft, and the way the house groaned in the cold. It was an old house, and it had its quirks. But tonight, as the storm raged outside, something about the air in the house felt thicker, heavier. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. It wasn't just the storm, though the wind's howls were unsettling. There was a strange energy in the house tonight, a sensation that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It started after he had eaten dinner, alone at the old oak table in the kitchen, where his grandmother had once prepared meals for the family. As he cleared the table, he noticed that the house felt quieter than usual. Too quiet. The wind outside had picked up, but there was no sound of it whipping against the windows like usual. The silence was oppressive, as though the storm had swallowed every sound around him. Sam went into the living room to start a fire in the old stone fireplace. But as he reached for the matches, he heard it. A soft thud. It came from upstairs. Sam froze, his hand still on the matchbox. The house was still and silent, but the thud came again. A heavy sound, like something falling onto the floor upstairs. He frowned. There was no reason for anything to be upstairs. He hadn't been up there in days, and everything had been locked tight. Yet the sound persisted, soft but distinct. A muffled thud followed by a dragging sound, like something was being pulled across the floor. Sam's first instinct was to laugh it off, to chalk it up to the wind or the house settling. But there was something about the sound, something unsettling about it that made him hesitate. He told himself it was just his imagination running wild, fueled by the eerie storm outside. After all, the old house had a way of playing tricks on your mind. He tried to ignore it and went back to preparing the fire, but the thudding continued. It was unmistakable now, as though someone was walking around upstairs. Feeling a growing unease, Sam grabbed a flashlight and made his way up the stairs. The air upstairs was colder than the rest of the house, and the silence felt more intense. Each step he took creaked loudly, the old wood protesting beneath his weight. He reached the top of the stairs and stood still, listening. The house was eerily quiet once again. The thudding had stopped, but now there was a faint smell in the air. It was hard to describe, but it was a sour, almost decaying odor. The smell made him uneasy, and he instinctively turned the knob of the nearest bedroom. The door creaked open, and Sam swept the flashlight across the room. Everything seemed normal, nothing out of place. The bed was neatly made, the window closed, and the floor was free from debris. He sighed with relief, thinking that perhaps the storm had played tricks on him. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A small, old rocking chair in the corner. It had been there when Sam moved in, one of the few pieces of furniture that had belonged to his grandmother. Sam had always thought it looked odd in the room, a relic of the past that didn't quite fit. But now, as he looked at it, something was off. The chair was moving. At first, it was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible. Then, it began to rock more noticeably, its wooden legs scraping against the floor with a rhythmic creak. Sam stood frozen in place, the flashlight in his hand trembling. The chair continued to move slowly at first, then picking up speed, the creaking growing louder, more frantic. The room felt colder, the air thick with a presence Sam couldn't explain. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the old floorboards had shifted with the wind, or the temperature had caused the chair to move on its own. But deep down, he knew that wasn't it. The chair was rocking on its own, and there was no logical explanation for it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the chair stopped. The room went deathly quiet again, the only sound being the howling wind outside. Sam stood there, his heart pounding, trying to catch his breath. He wanted to leave, to run downstairs and lock himself in, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by another noise. A soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. Sam's blood ran cold. "Help me." It was a voice, a faint, desperate voice coming from somewhere in the room. Sam's stomach churned. The words seemed to hang in the air, lingering like a ghostly presence. His first instinct was to bolt out of the room, to run as far from the house as possible, but he couldn't move. His legs were frozen, his body trembling with fear. "Please," the voice whispered again, this time closer, almost right next to him. "Help me." The air around him grew colder still, and the smell of decay grew stronger, filling his nostrils. Sam's flashlight flickered, and for a moment the light seemed to dance along the walls, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally. The temperature in the room dropped, his breath fogging in front of him. With a surge of panic, Sam finally turned and fled the room, rushing down the stairs and into the living room. His heart raced, and his breath came in short, panicked gasps. He locked the front door behind him and collapsed onto the couch, trembling uncontrollably. The fire in the hearth flickered and popped, but the room still felt impossibly cold. He tried to rationalize everything, tell himself it was just his imagination, that he had let the storm get to him. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Something was in the house with him. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Sam didn't sleep. He sat in the living room, listening to the wind howl outside, his ears straining for any sound. But the house was silent again. The storm raged on, and the minutes stretched into hours. It wasn't until dawn that the storm finally began to let up. The wind still howled, but the snow had stopped falling, leaving the world outside coated in a thick layer of white. Sam stood in the doorway, staring out at the snow-covered landscape, his mind reeling from the events of the night. He wasn't sure what had happened, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in the house, watching him. For the next few days, Sam couldn't bring himself to go back upstairs. He stayed downstairs, trying to convince himself that what he had experienced had been some sort of hallucination brought on by the storm. But the feeling of being watched never left him, and the house always felt colder than it should have been. The rocking chair never moved again, and the voice never spoke again. But Sam knew what he had heard, and he knew what he had felt. And as the days passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still waiting for him upstairs, in that cold, silent room. On cold, snowy nights like that, the house never felt quite the same. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was one of those nights when the wind howled through the trees like a living creature, and the snow fell thick and fast, turning the world outside into an impenetrable white void. Sarah was home alone, tucked into her small rural house at the edge of the woods. It wasn't the first time she'd been alone here. She'd lived in the house for several years, but tonight felt different. There was an eerie stillness in the air, a quietness that made her feel unnerved despite the warmth of the fireplace and the comfort of her favorite blanket wrapped around her. She glanced out the window. The snow was falling heavily now, the world beyond her property swallowed by a sheet of white, the outlines of the trees barely visible through the flurry. Sarah didn't mind the snow. She was used to these winter storms, but something about the way the wind gusted against the house made her uneasy. The house creaked with every gust, the windows rattling as if the storm was trying to get inside. She tried to shake off the feeling. It was just a storm, after all. The wind and snow had a way of playing tricks on your mind, making shadows seem darker, sounds seem sharper. Still, she couldn't help but feel like something was watching her. It wasn't an unfamiliar sensation. Over the years, she had gotten used to the peculiarities of the old house. It was an antique, passed down from her grandmother, who had lived there for decades before her. The house creaked and groaned, the kind of sounds one could expect from a house that had stood for so long. But it wasn't just the usual creaks that unsettled her tonight. It was the feeling that something was off. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and focused her attention on the book in her hands, trying to ignore the sensation creeping at the edges of her mind. Her grandmother had always warned her about the house. The whispers, the strange noises in the walls, the cold spots that seemed to appear out of nowhere. But Sarah had never been one to believe in ghosts. She'd grown up hearing those stories, the ones that were passed around like rumors, and while they unsettled her as a child, she had long since dismissed them as the product of an overactive imagination. Yet tonight, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to those stories than she had ever let herself believe. A loud thud broke through her thoughts, followed by the unmistakable sound of something scraping across the floor above her. Her heart skipped a beat, and she sat up straight, her breath catching in her throat. The house was empty. There was no one else here. Yet, the noise persisted. A heavy thump, followed by dragging like someone was moving furniture. Sarah stood up and walked slowly toward the staircase, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet on the floor. The house was eerily quiet now, save for the storm outside, and she felt a cold draft running down the hallway, seeping through the cracks in the walls. She felt her pulse quicken as she reached the bottom of the stairs, her eyes scanning the darkened hallway. There was nothing out of place, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sound from upstairs came again, a sharp thud, followed by the dragging noise. It seemed to come from the attic. She felt a chill run down her spine. Her grandmother's attic was always locked. It was a place that Sarah had avoided. She had been up there a few times as a child, but as she grew older, she never had the urge to go back. The old trunks, the strange wooden shelves filled with dusty boxes and forgotten relics from a past she didn't understand always made her feel uneasy. Taking a deep breath, Sarah made her way up the stairs, her hand shaking as she gripped the railing. She didn't want to go up there, didn't want to investigate. But the sounds were relentless. They were getting louder now, like footsteps in the attic, heavy and slow, as though someone was pacing back and forth. She reached the top of the stairs and froze, her eyes flicking toward the attic door. It was slightly ajar, as though it had been opened recently. The wind outside rattled the windows and the house groaned under the pressure, but there was no other sound, no footsteps, no dragging, just silence. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shiver up her arm. Sarah hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if it was just the house settling? She had heard that old houses sometimes made strange noises, especially during a storm, but the feeling in her gut told her that this was different. The attic door swung open on its own. She gasped and stepped back, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The door creaked as if something had just moved behind it, and Sarah could feel her heartbeat quicken. She could feel it. The pressure in the air, the thick heaviness that filled the space between her and the darkness beyond the door. The attic was silent, as if it were waiting for her. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward and pushed the door open wider. The light in the hallway flickered as she crossed the threshold into the attic. The air up here was cold, far colder than the rest of the house. The temperature dropped noticeably as she moved deeper into the attic, her breath clouding in front of her. She shivered, but she pressed on, determined to find the source of the noise. The attic was cluttered, just as she remembered it. Old furniture, wooden trunks stacked on top of each other, boxes filled with old clothes and knickknacks. The walls were lined with shelves, some empty, others holding forgotten relics. But it was the far corner that caught her attention. Something was wrong there. The shadows were too dark, too deep. And there in the corner was the faint out of something that hadn't been there before. At first, she thought it was just the shape of an old chair or a piece of furniture. But as she approached, the outline shifted. A cold gust of wind blew through the room, and the object seemed to move, as though it had been disturbed by something unseen. Sarah felt her heart race, and she took a step back, her pulse thundering in her ears. The air was thick with tension now, the atmosphere oppressive. And then a soft voice broke through the silence. "Help me." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The voice was soft, fragile, like a whisper carried on the wind. It seemed to come from the very walls of the attic surrounding her, making the room feel smaller, tighter. She spun around, her eyes wide, but there was no one there. "Help me." It was the same voice, and it was closer this time. It seemed to be coming from the corner. Sarah's legs shook as she stepped closer, her hand gripping the flashlight with white knuckles. She shone the light into the corner of the attic, but the beam of light flickered for Didgera, as if it couldn't quite focus on what was there. The voice came again, louder now, desperate. "Help me, please." Suddenly, the beam of light landed on something. A shape sitting hunched in the corner of the attic. Sarah's breath hitched in her chest. It was an old rocking chair, one she had never seen before. She had been up in the attic many times over the years, but this chair had never been here. It was an old-fashioned thing, made of dark wood, with a faded cushion and a cracked wooden armrest. The rocking motion had stopped, but the chair was still. And then it started again. Slowly, at first, just a faint creak, but it grew louder, more pronounced, as if someone was sitting in the chair, rocking back and forth, back and forth. Sarah's mind raced. Her heart pounded in her ears. The room was cold now, colder than ever. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow, to stretch across the walls as if they were alive. The voice was gone, but the rocking continued. She couldn't move, she couldn't breathe. The rocking chair was moving, and she knew. It wasn't her imagination. The house, the air, everything was thick with a presence that she could feel in her very bones. The door to the attic slammed shut behind her, making her jump, but she didn't turn. She couldn't. The rocking chair was rocking faster now, the sound like the groaning of old wood in the silence. And then, with a loud crack, the chair stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood frozen in place, her chest tight, her breathing shallow. She didn't know how long she stood there, not moving, not daring to make a sound. But when she finally gathered the courage to move, the house was still. The wind howled outside, the storm raging, but the house was silent. And Sarah knew, she knew that she had felt something in that attic, something old, something that had been waiting for her. She never went back to the attic. Story the end.